I'm just really thrilled to introduce to you today the Victor family, 3 generations of the Victor family. And I'll start with our guest of honor, Rena, who is sitting here in the middle. Rena is a retired preschool teacher who was born in Hamburg, Germany. Her mother lost her entire immediate and extended family, except for one cousin, in the Holocaust. After fleeing the bombing of Hamburg in 1943, Rena went into hiding with her mother and 2 sisters for 2 years until the war ended in 1945. She was not able to leave Germany, and then only with her mother, forced to leave 2 sisters and her father behind until 1951. Her non-Jewish father was drafted into the German army and worked in the underground to try to save Jews. Rena later married another Holocaust survivor. While she believes each survivor's story is unique, being a child of mixed marriage, her father was not Jewish, gives her a unique perspective. And then standing alongside me is Rena's daughter, Dr. Susan Victor, who is Professor Emerita in the Department of Curriculum Studies and Secondary Education here at Sonoma State, where she has taught adolescent development and classroom management to future middle and high school teachers for 24 years. Prior to that, Susan taught in the Department of Secondary Education at San Francisco State University for 9 years. Earlier in her teaching career, Susan taught high school German. She did not hear about her family's experiences in the Holocaust until she was in her 20s. She is on the board of the Alliance, and she chairs the education committee at the Alliance. And then sitting on the far right is Micah Victor Lesch, who is Rena's grandson and Susan's son. And Micah is currently in his 2nd year at the University of California College of Law, San Francisco, formerly known as UC Hastings. In law school, Michael is on the team of students representing a refugee in affirmative asylum proceedings. And Micah hopes to represent refugees and asylum seekers in court after he graduates. Micah graduated from UC Davis in 2019 with a degree in history. It's an awesome major. And with minors in Jewish studies and human rights studies. After graduating from UC Davis, Micah spent 3 years as director of Jewish student life at Berkeley Hillel, which is the Jewish Student Center at UC Berkeley. He coordinated that organization's social justice program. So we're really thrilled to have the Victors with us today.
Again, good afternoon. And I'm very honored and happy to be here to talk to you. My name is Rena Victor, and I live in Marin County, and I'm a retired.
They might have forgotten.
Okay. I am a retired preschool teacher. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, good. I left Germany in 1951 after surviving the Holocaust and 6 years of post-war reconstruction in Germany. I'm here to tell you the story of my family surviving the Holocaust in Germany. Since I was a young child during that time, my recollections and memories may be mixed with what my mother told me. I know you heard another survivor story last week. It is important to remember that every survivor has a unique story. I've had the honor of speaking to hundreds of students in grades 5 through 12 and college. I try to connect my story to what the students are reading or learning and to their own lives in the hopes that they can stand up to racism and anti-Semitism. I know you're familiar with the events leading up to the Holocaust from your first lecture, how Hitler came to power and the history and nature of anti-Semitism in Germany. As you know, there were essentially 2 wars going on in Germany, Hitler's war of expansion and Hitler's war with the Jews. My story takes place in this context. The experience of German Jews was unique. as this quote from Yad Vashem describes well. German Jews defined themselves as both Germans and Jews. Life under Nazi rule forced most of the Jewish population into a severe identity crisis. Germany, the homeland whose values and culture the Jews had adopted, was rejecting them. We, myself, my daughter, and my grandchildren feel both German and Jewish. But it became a complex identity, obviously after the Holocaust. For example, we are comfortable speaking and hearing the German language, unlike most survivors or children of survivors. And we have returned to Germany several times, although those trips are not easy. First, a brief history or a reminder of the events leading up to the Holocaust, which you learned about in your first lecture. 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted. These laws, as you know, severely limited the rights of the Jewish people and how Jewish people could live their lives. First and most significant, their citizenship was taken. Jewish people could at first only go out, for example, to the market at certain times. There was a curfew just for Jews. They had to go to the back of lines. They had to give up driver's licenses. They couldn't be doctors or lawyers or teachers. They couldn't marry non-Jews. They couldn't even have pets. They couldn't go to school. They weren't allowed to walk on the sidewalk. Eventually, they couldn't keep their homes or belongings and were forced to move in with other Jewish people, often complete strangers. These places were referred to as Judenhäuser or Jewish houses. Micah will discuss these in his presentation. November 9th, 1938 came Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. It marked the beginning of the end for German Jews. In March of 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. I was born 2 months after the war started in November of 1939. Here's some background about me that is important for you to know, but as was already said, I was born in Hamburg, which, as you might know, is a large harbour city in northern Germany. My mother was Jewish, my father was not. They married in June of 1935, just before the Nuremberg law was enacted, which would prohibit their marriage. I almost died as an infant, and the Nazi doctor told my father to just let me die, and my father threw him out of the house. I had 2 older sisters, pictures of whom you saw on the first slide. My father owned a grocery store in the Jewish neighborhood, Grindelviertel in Hamburg. Excuse me. The store was vandalized by the Nazis who painted graffiti on it, like "Don't shop in Jewish stores." The tires on his delivery truck were slashed. He was called to the Gestapo after he physically stopped the Hitler Youth from vandalizing his store and was given 14 days to close the store. Friends started avoiding my mother. They crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. A close friend since childhood all of a sudden stopped talking to her. Her circle of friends diminished or became non-existent. One time, some Hitler youth harassed her and her mother, calling them terrible things. My grandmother, who was a very proper lady, swore back at them, shocking my mother. She said, "Man muss mit denen reden in der Sprache, die sie verstehen." In other words, you must speak to them in a language they understand. This is a picture of my grandparents. My grandfather had strong feelings that Jewish people should assimilate and should be able to live wherever they choose to. He died 10 years before the war started. My uncle was still in public school, where students sang terrible songs about killing Jews. Then he was forced to leave and attend a Jewish school. Eventually, that school was closed in 1942 when deportations began. The principal and all the teachers were later murdered by the Nazis. We were then very worried about the safety of my grandmother and uncle. They were forced to leave their apartments. The Nazis confiscated the apartment and all their belongings and came to live with us. My father, who was a German soldier by that time, thought that he could protect my grandmother and my uncle. But eventually the Nazis took them away in November of 1949. 41, excuse me. My uncle was only 20 years old. From the information we have, we learned that they were gassed in a truck on the way to Minsk in Russia. Tragically, his girlfriend's family was able to leave to the United States and had wanted to take him with them, but he wouldn't leave his mother and sister. This slide showed the documentation of their deportation and death from the Yad Vashem database. My father had to join the German Air Force, Luftwaffe. Again, there were two wars going on, Hitler's war of expansion and Hitler's war on the Jews. Like many or most non-Jewish men, my father was drafted. During his time as a soldier, he helped in the underground or resistance by getting the names and addresses of Jewish people whom the Nazis were going to pick up. Because he was in the Air Force, he actually had to fly Nazis. There's also a story about getting the Nazis drunk, and his friend, an artist, painted their portraits. He was then able to get more information so that he could protect Jews. He had a small book with notes of this information. One time he dropped it in a hotel room. The maid found it and returned it to him. He could have easily been arrested and killed by the Nazis if she had turned him in. He was arrested once in Belgium and beaten for information, but was released. He had also been arrested or summoned previous times and told he had to divorce my mother. The injuries he endured in prison affected him his whole life and probably contributed to his death in his early 70s. Two of his brothers were also involved with the underground and were killed by the Nazis. This slide shows my father in uniform at the graveside of one of his brothers, as well as a portrait that painted it of my father. After the war, my father was involved with the efforts to track down Nazis. He never really stopped. One day in 1943, my mother was summoned by the Gestapo to come to the Rathaus, City Hall. This probably happened multiple times. She was told by the SS officer that they had a letter from my father that he wanted to divorce her because he didn't want to be married to a Jew anymore, or something like that. My mother knew they were lying and said, "I have to see that letter for myself." The SS officer claimed he didn't have it but would get it. But in the meantime, she would have to stay at City Hall and clean all the floors. Every time she was summoned, she brought me and my sisters with her, this time as well. So she responded she couldn't clean the floors because she had her children to watch. The officer said something like they would watch the children, which was of course frightening. The officer said something like they would watch. That's where just my mother took her right hand out of her pocket, a hand on which she had only these two fingers. The others had been lost because of an accident. The Nazi officer may have been shocked, or maybe he felt sympathetic, but he let her go. Hamburg was bombed by the Allied forces for 10 days and nights. To survive the bombing, we had to go into a bomb shelter, which was typically in the basement of apartment buildings like the one we lived in. Every bomb shelter had a Gauleiter or area leader appointed by the Nazis. This Gauleiter would not let my mother into the bomb shelter because she was Jewish. He was willing to allow the three of us in because our father was a German soldier. The night we were bombed out, the neighbors in the apartment building essentially forced him to let my mother in. We don't know for sure how, but they either beat him up or killed him. Before fleeing our demolished apartment building, My mother threw her identification papers, which showed she was Jewish, and the yellow star Jews were forced to wear, into the fire. As Hamburg was burning, we were evacuated by train with almost 1 million other people to Hof, a small town in Bavaria in southern Germany. As we fled, my mother carrying me and holding the hand of my sister and one bag, which contained a change of clothing and some photographs. The woman offered to carry the bag. We don't know if she took it or it was lost in the crowds of people running. And that was the last we saw of it. All we had left were the clothes we were wearing. When we arrived in Hof, we were first herded into a big school gym, where the residents of the town could look at us and decide to whom to offer shelter. We lived in the attic of a Nazi woman who thought she was sheltering the family of a soldier. This was incredibly scary for my mother, as the woman, of course, had no idea that she was Jewish. She had to lie, for example, when the woman wanted her to come downstairs and listen to Hitler speak on the radio. She would say, "Sie müssen kommen, der Führer spricht." My mother sent letters to everyone she knew in Hamburg in the hopes my father would find us and realize we were alive and we had survived the bombing. She also sent him a telegram. We are fortunate to have the original copies of these documents, which you see in this slide. In the meantime, my father returned to Hamburg to find our apartment building destroyed. He left this note on the building: "Who knows where my family is?" These pictures are in a book about the Jews from Hamburg. Eventually, one of the friends who got a letter from my mother let him know where we were. He sent my mother a telegram instructing her to return to Hamburg, where he had found us a hiding place on a farm. Because the trains were not running on any kind of schedule, my mother took us to the station every day until we could get back on a train to Hamburg. We realized then that it was no longer safe for us and we had to go into hiding. My father arranged for us to be hidden by friends of his who were also hiding for his from the Nazis. Here we stayed for 2 years, from 1943 to 1945. We lived in a shack that my father got and sent because he was in charge of securing and setting up prefabricated buildings and finding houses for soldiers. For those 2 years, we had no water, no food, no again. My mother and the elderly man who lived on the farm had make beds for us, and she sewed sheets together and pillows which she stuffed with hay. I remember we had to sleep in our shoes, and always someone had to be on the lookout for the Gestapo. The friends never told the neighbors that my mother was hidden there, only that they were taking care of 3 children of the German soldiers. I'm not sure how we got food, but we were able to plant some vegetables, and the woman got us children some food with ration cards. My oldest sister walked to a well for water. They also rigged some electricity from the main house. My mother secretly listened to the radio so she could follow the warnings. In April of 1945, we hear that Hitler died and know the war will be over soon. Suddenly one day, my father came. He startled us. We didn't recognize him. We moved back to Hamburg and lived together until we emigrated. Hamburg was almost totally destroyed by the bombing, so it was very hard to find somewhere to live. We lived with other survivors, then with a close friend of my mother's, who would later become my mother-in-law. I'm not sure where else, but several places with several people. Every day my mother listened to the radio because they would read the names of survivors of the concentration camps. She desperately listened for any family member, but only heard one cousin's name. Later, my mother will realize only she and this one cousin survived. More than 50 members of her family were killed by the Nazis. We were very poor and had nothing after the war. Also, the anti-Semitism persisted. My oldest sister, who had returned to school, even heard it from teachers. People looked at us and wondered and even asked why or how we survived. Because our parents had no money and had to get their lives together, we three sisters were moved into a home provided by the Warburg family. The Warburgs were a German Jewish family living in the United States who donated their home in a neighborhood north of Hamburg for Jewish orphans and children who had survived the war and maybe had no family or the family had no money for a stable home like us. This gave me and my sisters shelter and food and a community and a safe place to be Jewish. While my sister and I were in the children's home, my mother, who was now on her own, works desperately every day on immigration to America. Excuse me. It was awful for her to live in Hamburg those 6 years. Excuse me. Not just because of the bumped eyeballs everywhere, but because we always looked over her shoulder, afraid and wondering if that person was a Nazi and that killed her mother and brother. It's a picture of the page in a notebook in which you can see some of her notes about leaving. I'm so sorry. My mother was an incredibly resilient and brave woman. Here are two stories that illustrate that. One day she was driving and was stopped by a police officer who asked for her license, which she didn't have. She said to the officer at the start of the war, you took my license from me. Now I'm waiting for you to give it back. Let her go. She also refused to wait in line. For example, once at a post office, she went to the front of the line. And when people complained, she said, at the start of the war, you didn't allow me as a Jew to stand in line with you. Now I refuse to stand in line with you. It was something she unfortunately continued to do here. She never waited.
It's become a bit of a problem.
Yeah. In order to get to America, like now, people had to have a sponsor, family or friends in America who would promise to support you. It took a long time and effort to convince relatives in Illinois to provide that. My mother, who had an uncle in Illinois who had been very willing, but sadly he died before that could happen. And his three sons weren't sure. Finally, one agreed to sponsor us, but only if my mother brought one daughter only. I was in the 5th grade then and 11 years old, so I could go half price. And as I said, I was the youngest. It was a devastating decision for my mother. It was very, very hard to leave my sisters and my father. One sister came a year later, but the other not for 4 years. My father did not want my middle sister to come. I did not see my father again until I was 31, and my daughter Susan was 11, which was the age I was when I left. I'm sorry. The feelings associated with this separation never left me or my sisters. This separation was something we never fully healed from. I'm sorry.
Water.
Maybe a minute. Excuse me. I'm so
Pause
sorry.
for water, ponder what she said so far. It doesn't sound like you're drinking alcohol. That would be embarrassing.
That could have been a rain.
That could have been good. It's the only visit my mother's father made to the United States, like 20 years after.
He was so confused. Susan was the
I was just
age
gonna
I was
say
when
that.
I'm sorry.
I know I have this 11-year-old memory. This is me, in case you haven't figured that out, from her and my grandparents. But he got off the plane and I didn't understand very much German at 11, but I remember him getting off and staring at me and saying, looking very confused for a minute.
Yes.
So time had stopped, you know.
Yes. Okay. We
Immigration.
emigrated to America on a ship called Queen Elizabeth. Friends who lived in England and paid for the tickets. Very generous people. I turned 12 on the ship. It was not easy in America either. I had to confront prejudice against Germans when they heard my accent, and anti-Semitism, along with the racism faced by African Americans. There were signs by public pools, for example, that read no Negroes, Jews, or dogs allowed. My mother had to quickly find work, where she also faced anti-Semitism. She could not get hired by several insurance companies, for example. And I had to go to public school, not understanding or speaking any English. A few years later, we moved to Southern California, where I attended high school and then married another survivor and had 2 children. In 2006, I and my sister and several other people who had lived in the children's home after the war were invited by an organization for a reunion at the home. Here are pictures of the survivors who attended, including me and my 2 sisters. I was interviewed for a local newspaper, you see on this slide, and was invited to speak to high school students in German, which wasn't easy. One student commented what it was like to meet a survivor and Jew. In 2019, I read in the Marin IJ that Felix Rohrberg had died, which reminded me of our time in the home. Since there was no mention of the home, I wrote a letter to the newspaper. This picture of my mother's immediate extended family at a wedding in 1922. A relative in Illinois had sent it to her. My mother could not tolerate having it in her home. It was just too painful. Out of all the people there, only my mother, who's right here, the one with the bow, and one cousin survived. All the rest had perished. And it's a remarkable picture because it has not only my grandparents in it, but it has my great-grandparents in it. It's amazing. And we were very grateful for it. Yes, now it hangs in Susan's house. Germany has taken responsibility and made efforts to make the history of the Holocaust public, to display reminders outside where everyone can see. The Stolpersteine can be seen as an example. There are currently more than 90,000 of these stumbling stones that you see in this slide, in 1,200 locations in 30 countries for victims of the Nazis. They are small brass plaques on top of cement blocks, installed in the sidewalk or driveway at the last known residence of the victim. The wait list to get one is 6 months or longer. My sisters and I had these 2 placed for our grandmother and uncle. Every time we or my daughter and grandchildren go to Hamburg, we visit the Stolpersteine. In fall of 2021, a Stolpersteine or stumbling stone was installed for my first husband's grandmother, with whom he was close as a child. My grandson Micah began to do the research during his last year of college in 2017 to have this Stolpersteine installed. The pandemic led to delay, but in 2022, Susan and her son Micah went to Berlin to see it. Micah will describe all this more in detail. The artist Günther Demnig says the goal is to recover the humanity and identity of victims by placing the stones on their last known residence. He also explains how important it is for young people to know and remember the history by seeing it everywhere. To remember that even in a land of Dichter and Denker, poets and thinkers, this could happen. The social justice lawyer Brian Stevenson talks about the Stolpersteine, an inspiration for the lynching memorial in Alabama. There are other public memorials throughout Germany, like railroad tracks listing deportations and signs on stores that had been owned by Jewish people prior to the war. Unlike most survivors, I have returned to Germany a few times. As I mentioned earlier, I have some non-Jewish cousins there, and as a German Jew, I still speak German, as I also mentioned earlier, although it is upsetting that sometimes Jewish people get uncomfortable when they hear my accent or hear me speak German. I still feel somewhat connected to Hamburg, although I would never live there again. I have been invited to speak to high school students in Germany, in Hamburg and Lesch, where my father was born, and students who had never met a Jewish person. I more recently returned to Hamburg in October of 2022, and here's a picture of my cousin and I visiting the Stolpersteine. It's not easy for these German cousins to speak about what happened to us. So his coming with me was very significant and important. This quote from Elie Wiesel explains what the Holocaust and my experience means today, why I talk to students, and why my daughter and grandchildren know and help me share my story. I ask students of all ages to please consider how the Holocaust is relevant to their education and to lives fulfilled. How racism and anti-Semitism, prejudice, scapegoating against immigrants, Asian Americans, Muslims, gays, transgender people are present in our lives today, not only in person, but on the internet. For the survivor who chooses to testify, it is clear his duty is to bear witness for the dead and for the living. He has no right to deprive future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget would not only be dangerous, but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. Thank you all for listening.
While we're transitioning from my mother's presentation to mine, I just want you to ponder the numbers that are on the slide. Okay, good. Because having been a teacher for so long, I don't like, transition time. I didn't take particular note of the numbers I highlighted. I think Hamburg is a city of just under 2 million now. I think the population of Germany is around 84 million. Prior to the Holocaust, Hamburg had one of the largest Jewish populations in Germany. Started at 17,000. At the end of the war, there were 1,268 Jewish people left in Hamburg, including my mother, her two sisters, her mother, and the one cousin. I highlighted the deportations in 1941, the numbers, which included my mother's grandmother and uncle. And the number of Jews who were left in Hamburg in 41 after the deportations, most of whom were Misch-Ehe in German, mixed marriages, like my grandparents. And then 106,000 people were held at Fuhlsbüttel. Fuhlsbüttel is actually the name of the airport in Hamburg, but it was a satellite camp of Neuengamme concentration camp that was located near Hamburg. More than half of the prisoners were killed. Among the half who survived was my father, Rena's husband.
Yeah, I don't mind.
So, like Stephen told you, I've been a professor at SSU for 24 years in the School of Education. I actually retired last June, but this place doesn't let you leave very easily. So, more on that later, but I'm back teaching two sections of an adolescent development class for teachers this semester. It's really actually quite hard to leave this place. What I'm talking to you about today is not the identity I brought to this work, my work as a professor at SSU, at least not explicitly for the 24 years here, as I was busy being a professor and parent of two children. I look at the lecture series posters and I think I should be part of that, but somehow I had to keep it at a distance. I told myself I didn't have time and it wasn't why I was here. It wasn't my job, but it was and still is hard to bring the deeply personal thing I'm about to say to this place. The photos of me on this slide are from my first 5 trips to Hamburg, starting from ages 16 to 23. I'm in these pictures with my father's mother, who prior to my parents' marriage was a good friend of her mother's. A little bit hard to keep straight. She was not Jewish. As someone who teaches about identity development, adolescence, it's clear to me that these trips cemented an identity for me. It's from 16 to 23 with that place, with Hamburg, with Germany, with the language, the identity that was available to me. Because as you looked at those numbers on the previous slide, the German Jewish identity really no longer existed. My story as a daughter of Holocaust survivors begins with 2 conversations. One with my grandmother, my mother's mother, and the other with my father, who was also a survivor, as you heard. The first conversation takes place when I'm 12 years old, watching my grandmother cook dinner. Warum denkst du, kommen sie so spät? Why do you think they're coming so late? She asked me, referring to my parents who were working. This was her speaking German to me for the first time in my life. That was the start of my lessons and not just of German. Prior to that, I had at times heard she and my mother speak German, never my father, although I remember him mentioning a favorite street in Berlin called Unter den Linden. This question marked the beginning for me of learning their story. 4 years later came the first trip to Hamburg at the age of 16 with my maternal grandmother, from whom who just heard about. I reflect on the identity confusion of an adolescent intensified by the looks on my grandmother's face, alternatively anger, fear, panic. We had come to Hamburg to move my paternal grandmother, who was not Jewish, into assisted living. As my mother mentioned in her presentation, my 2 grandmothers were close friends, and that friendship required that my maternal grandmother make the trip she never wanted to make, to return to Germany. That trip was followed by 4 more I had to take alone throughout my adolescence and college years to see my father's mother, because he never dared to return to Germany. His mother was not Jewish and was actually the daughter of Otto Schoenfelder, who was earlier the mayor of Hamburg and then president of Descendant after the war. This is actually a picture of him shaking the hand of Queen Elizabeth. He was responsible for, I don't remember what it was called, but he was the first president of the parliament right after the war. So worked with Konrad Adenauer to form essentially the constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany. I always wondered, but was never told why my father never went to visit his mother. As summers would approach, he would ask me, "Will you go see my mother?" Which of course I could not say no to, despite my 20-something self-sensing. It may have been more of a sacrifice than I allowed myself to feel. My father's father, who was a somewhat well-known communist Jewish writer, fled Germany for Switzerland and then New York in 1935, abandoning his half-Jewish sons, my father at age 10 and his older brother was 12. I studied German for 9 years in high school and college, including a class about the writer Heinrich Heine, in which the professor, who had read my grandfather's books, was noticeably thrilled as he read my last name. The C I got in that class was mortifying. I developed a bond with Hamburg, as well in German we'd say mein zweites Heimat, my second home, over those 4 trips alone. None of my relatives in Hamburg ever spoke about me or my family being Jewish or about the Holocaust. At home, nobody did either. We celebrated Christmas and Easter. My father watched World War II movies. He seemed to suffer many health problems, including the inability to eat anything that had fat in it, butter, meat fat, the yellow of eggs. He often looked distant and preoccupied. My 8th grade US history teacher showed slides of the concentration camps. I remember one with piles of shoes and glasses. I remember feeling like there was a spotlight on me, but I didn't know why. The year I turned 23, the other conversation took place. My father was diagnosed with cancer, and knowing I assumed that he wouldn't have long to live, sat me on the couch, and in what I recall as a 10-minute conversation, told me about the circumstances of leaving Germany. His primary goal in telling me was worried that his brother and others would distort the truth. I remember very little content of that conversation, but recall feeling immobile with the seriousness of it. He didn't talk to me too much directly. And seeing the stunned and worried faces of my mother and grandmother, I think my mother said, "You're telling her this?" He died a year or so later, 1 month before his 60th birthday and 2 weeks after my 25th. The threads that followed from these two conversations tell you what it means to me to be a daughter of German Jewish Holocaust survivors. My mother and her mother's story became an integrated, increasingly cohesive part of my personal and professional identity. It coalesced into a purpose I can hold on to as an educator. I became a German teacher in the 1980s. I faced a student who defined himself as a neo-Nazi in my first year. He drew swastikas on his work. When I asked him why he was taking German, he answered, "To learn the language of the master race." In his evaluation of my teaching, the principal mentioned the incident and my identity as, quote, "of Jewish heritage." I think what I perceived as the principal's keeping my Jewishness at a distance bothered me more than the student's behavior. After 40 years of silence, my grandmother was willing to speak to students, first to my high school classes, then later to the classes of my education students at San Francisco State. How hard this was for her is reflected in this story. I brought her to present to an 8th grade English class taught by one of my student teachers at a middle school in San Francisco. As she began, she seemed to lose her composure and hesitate. Which was very uncharacteristic of her. I took her out in the hall. "What's wrong, Min?" There were some held back tears. She never cried. She said, "I didn't know they would be so young. Why should they hear this?" I think of that now and I think it's a thread connecting her and my mother and me and my daughter. This mandate to protect vulnerable adolescents was more compelling for her to my grandmother than telling them the story of her pain and loss. In my later 20s, I joined second generation groups where I experienced marginalization as a German Jew. One member said to me, "Your family probably didn't think it would happen to them." I read Helen Epstein's book, Children of the Holocaust. I could only read a few pages at a time because my heart raced and I felt faint as I read stories of my life mirrored in the lives of other daughters and sons of survivors. There's a line there are many lines I underlined in this book, and it's, as you can see, it's almost falling apart because I read it so many times, but there's a line here where a child of survivors is reflecting on her father's behavior, and she seemed to be in another world, raging at people that we could not see. And that describes my father as well. I fortunately married the son of a German Jewish refugee, had a Jewish wedding, raised 2 glorious children. My husband and I careful to tell the Holocaust story consciously and deliberately, hoping to avoid or minimize third generation trauma. That second conversation, the 10-minute conversation with my father, to this day, left me with dark words. He'd muse at dinner. "Best exercise I ever got was digging graves." And dark sounds, his nightmares. And dark actions, how he screamed when we wasted food. His obvious fear of die Behörde, the officials, whether they were in uniform or in the mail. His fear of leaving this country, which he never did. Hamburg, to which I have returned 5 more times since age 23, while still its Zweites Heimat, a second home, leads to weeks of sleepless nights as I approach the trip. The first 24 hours or so, sometimes paralyzed with fear, I won't be able to get out. Then horror that my children, even as adults, now have to see that. The thread from that conversation on the couch is fragmented and dark and unclear and full of gaps and still hard to talk to. It's integrated into my identity in messy and uncomfortable ways because, of course, it's a story that has left me with second generation trauma. What we have been able to find out from some of his documents you see on these next few slides. This is documentation of his imprisonment at the concentration camp Fuhlsbüttel. It looks like there were 2 periods in 1944 and then again 44 to 45. Lager, KZ Lager, KZ Lager is the concentration camp. And up here, actually on the left above his picture, it says Judenlager Ohlsdorf. Ohlsdorf is the large cemetery, is the cemetery in Hamburg. This is his identification. And you can see he tried to cross out the swastika with it. It's interesting. His documentation that he was persecuted because Jews have to prove that they had been persecuted or the victims of the Nazis in order to receive what unfortunately is called in German Wiedergutmachung, which translates literally as to make good again. That's the word for restitution. My father was arrested at the age of 17 in 1944 by the Nazis following his older brother's arrest for anti-Nazi actions. He was in solitary confinement for 6 weeks at Fuhlsbüttel prison in Hamburg. And then once they realized he was half Jewish, was transferred to Ohlsdorf Neuengamme concentration camp where he was for more than a year. He was indeed forced to dig mass graves. His health, notably his eating problems, which may have stemmed from starvation and then from eating rich fatty foods too quickly after being released, were compounded his whole life by symptoms of PTSD. His brother was sent to Buchenwald. He also survived, but the way he coped with the effects could not have been more different. And that ultimately affected their relationship, I think. And I think it affected my father's lack of trust in his brother. Oh, I just added this yesterday because I found his immigration papers. I don't even know if you noticed this. He immigrated exactly 10 years to the day before my birth. I was born January 24th, 1960, and I just saw this yesterday. That's why I put this in. My father's father, returned to Germany in 1948. This is a picture of, this picture pains me and my mother greatly. The picture of my father not long after being released, right? Very thin, picking up his father when he arrived. That's his father with the pipe and carrying his suitcase. He, my grandfather, was embraced by the East German Communist government and given a home to live and a teaching position at the University of Jena. His efforts to rebuild a relationship with my father were understandably rejected. Just an aside about this on this side here, this is a page in a photo album. That's my father visiting right after he came home, his father. I think the symbolism for us of seeing my quite thin, gaunt-looking father next to his quite well-fed father is both painful and symbolic, honestly. But an aside about this page of a photo album, you can see that 2 pictures were torn out. Micah will appreciate me telling the story. My paternal grandmother wrote over 100 books. Oh, wait, let me just tell you about this. Oh, yeah. My paternal grandfather wrote over 100 books. There was a picture of him back. It doesn't even matter. You saw it. I don't even care. I mean, I have all 100. I can't read. But he was quite well known in the GDR, in the German Democratic Republic in East Germany. After his death, his widow, who was his wife, we're not sure, gave all his writings, documents, and photographs to the Akademie der Künste archives in Berlin. In 2019, my son and I spent hours looking through these archives. When we came across this and other pages from a photo album with photos obviously missing, I remembered quite suddenly that in 1988, my husband and I visited Weimar. This was a year before Germany's reunification. We stayed in the house where his widow lived, the house which was probably returned to its rightful owners after Germany reunified. My grandfather's wife was reluctant to let me take any pictures. So full of resentment I was that this man had abandoned my father as a child, leaving him to suffer in a concentration camp as a teenager. I got up in the middle of the night and simply stole several of the pictures, including the 2 missing from this page. That was in 1988, and Mike and I saw this page in 2019. And what's on the left, where I crossed out, I kept a detailed diary during that trip, and there, because when I get emotional, German's hard for me, so I was writing out what I'm going to say to her, and then I decided, hell with it, and I crossed it out and got up and just took the pictures. My good story. Both my grandfathers died when I was 12. I remember my father getting the letter informing him of his father's death. He cried briefly, but didn't say anything. My son and daughter, my daughter's sitting back there, have bravely and compassionately tried to continue to piece together the story of our family. And more importantly, they let these stories inform the kind of work they've chosen to do and how they do that work. My son recently researched what happened to my father's grandfather, with whom my mother told you what he was close as a child, with the goal of installing a Stolpersteine for her. He's going to share that process with you. Before turning it over to Micah, I want to close by saying I remain not totally at home in either identity because, as I said earlier, the bicultural identity of German Jew doesn't exist anymore. I have German relatives I love, as my mother does. But even after seeing the Stolpersteine with this cousin, she asked me, why actually did your family leave Germany? I love the language, but as my mother said, hesitate speaking in front of other survivors or children of survivors. I learned enough about Judaism to raise our two children with holidays and bar and bat mitzvahs, but Germany is still more homeland than Israel ever could be. I was recently reading about diasporism, which for me defines a Jewish identity that travels and settles in a place for however long it is allowed to contribute and integrate. Perhaps the only places the German and Jewish identities come together in a meaningful way for me is when I walk through Hamburg or Berlin and see the Stolpersteine, or when I'm sitting at a meeting of the Alliance members, my speakers, and sensing the thread that connects us, the second generation. Elizabeth Rosner, from whom you'll hear at a future lecture, I believe in 2 weeks, describes our experience well when she writes in her book, Survivor Cafe. We keep trying to name what we are carrying, attempting to transform it into something beautiful, something healing, something that cannot quite be let go of, cannot quite be held on to. Even now, the notion of naming myself according to the near-death experiences of my parents strikes me as both a puzzle and a certainty. Thank you.
Everyone. This is all quite heavy. I would suggest that this room, before I begin, we all take a communal deep breath. Can we all do that together?
I like that.
Very good, Brad. Okay.
I told him to be a teacher.
I said no, thank you. Everyone, my name is Micah Victor Lesch. Before I begin, like my mother said, I also want to mention that I'm here with my wonderful sister, Davita. Hi, Davita. If you do happen to have questions about sort of the third generation experience, I would suggest you direct them to her because she's far more articulate than I.
She's also deserves a lot of gratitude for helping make the slides look better.
And he's also good. As I said, I'm the proud son of Susan, the proud grandson of Rena, whom I call Omi. As was already mentioned, I currently live in San Francisco, where I'm a second year at UC Law San Francisco, formerly known as UC Hastings. I graduated from UC Davis in 2019, where I studied history, Jewish studies, and human rights studies. Because like after you heard my family history, what else was I going to study? I'd like to spend our remaining time discussing what you might call my third generation experience. That is the ways in which growing up hearing my grandmother's stories about her experiences and our shared history, as well as my mother's reflections, have shaped my own identity and perspective. You can see us here. This was in Berlin many years ago when I studied abroad there in college on a street, Unter den Linden, that my mother mentioned. One of many streets in Berlin where Jews were once not allowed. I recall having good beer and lots of chocolate on that trip. So it might seem a bit unusual, but I'm actually going to begin by reading the first 2 pages of my law school admissions essay. Because after much wordsmithing, I believe the statement captures the true weight and significance of my grandmother's stories in my life. Some of what you'll hear in this statement will repeat what both my grandmother and mother have shared. A few months ago, I woke up to an email from the district government of Charlottenburg, Berlin, Germany, with the subject line, Stolperstein, Siebelstraße 19 eingebietet. The stumbling stone at Siebel Street 19 has been put in place. Attached to this email was a picture of an elderly man placing a small brass plaque into a hole in the city sidewalk of a West Berlin suburb, which you'll see here. The plaque, or Stolperstein, stumbling stone, is now one in a Europe-wide network of plaques placed in the ground in front of the last known residences of those persecuted, deported, and murdered during the Holocaust. During the Nazi era, gravestones from desecrated Jewish cemeteries were used to build sidewalks, adding insult to the painful indignities the Jews had already suffered. As if emerging from the ground and refusing to be buried, The Stolpersteine are a subtle yet public reply to this demonization and objectification, and are one outgrowth of the country's process of reconciliation. In German, the word is Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which literally means struggling to come to terms with the past. Engraved on the plaque at Siebel Street 19 were the words in German. And you can see here lived Rena Victor, born 1873, reported to Theresienstadt, August 20th, 1942, murdered September 4th, 1942. Regina is one of the 6 million Jews whose lives ended in the ghettos, concentration, and death camps of Central and Eastern Europe. Regina was also my great-great-grandmother. The installation of the Stolpersteine was the culmination of work I began while studying at the Freie Universität in 2017, where I conducted archival research in German to locate Regina's final place of residence. Through this research, I discovered that Regina was imprisoned in a Jewish house, or a Judenhaus, for over a year before being deported to the Theresienstadt ghetto. Regina's story would later inspire me to return to Berlin in 2019 to continue my research and craft a thesis analyzing the network of Jewish houses in Germany. This is just one of the many important stories, some just fragments of stories, that define my family history. My maternal grandparents, upon surviving the Holocaust and spending 6 years in post-war Germany, never fully worked through the insurmountable wounds of the war years. My mother was not told that she was Jewish until she was 23 years old. Indeed, if the horrors of the Holocaust were discussed at all, it was only in fragments. At a young age, I learned that in 1943, my grandmother went to sleep each night in a small makeshift shed tucked behind a farmhouse, hearing the sounds of bombs destroying her home city of Hamburg and wearing shoes under her covers in case she needed to run. After immigrating to the United States, my grandfather often mused darkly that the best exercise he ever had was digging mass graves at the Neuengamme concentration camp. Despite the fragmented nature of these stories, as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, I carry an uncomfortable awareness of their profound suffering, and in many ways, my interest in a career in human rights, refugee, and asylum law represents my own unique way of processing this history. I do not believe that there's a simple cause and effect relationship between my grandparents' stories and my professional interests. However, the remnants of intergenerational trauma that persist in my family remind me that at one time my grandparents suffered, lost dozens of their family members, and were ultimately powerless to fight one of the gravest injustices in human history. It is for this reason that I feel pushed towards justice, to, with the constant reminder of a great wrong my ancestors could do nothing about then, make things as right as possible. So those were the first 2 pages of my law school admissions essay. Hopefully you'd allow me into law school if you read that. Apparently they were. So I have grown up processing the harrowing and in many ways debilitating stories of my grandparents, as you can tell from this statement, in 2 primary ways. The first is to channel that deeply held frustration and feeling of helplessness one feels when hearing about one's family history into a passion for human rights and refugee issues. The second is to funnel that anxiety and stress into conducting family research, which I'm sure many of you in this room have also done, and which I've been passionate about from an early age when my Omi began to answer every question I could think of regarding our shared history. My Omi and I often joke that our hours-long phone call conversations always consist of joking around, talking politics, me peppering her with questions about her life and our family history, and then finally making plans for our next grandmother-grandson date to the opera or to the symphony. Constantly digging deeper into my family history with my grandmother is a key element of my 3rd generation experience. In that vein, I'd like to share with you a bit more about the family research I conducted while in Berlin, which inspired my honors thesis some years ago that I mentioned. I choose to share these details with you not just because this room is filled with history majors and folks I'm sure who are interested in history like I am, but because the process of uncovering a story to add to my shared family history was one of the most emotional and meaningful experiences of my life. In the process of conducting research to have Regina Stolpersteine created, see here, work which involved sifting through hundreds of documents in German in 5 different archives. I uncovered a captivating story about a member of my family who is uniquely remembered to have been an early feminist, a rebellious and tenacious woman who even clandestinely wrote as a political columnist for a Berlin newspaper under a male pseudonym. You can see pictures of Regina here in various different kinds of hats. Despite uncovering these and other fascinating details, which allowed me to piece together a picture of Regina's life, the process of locating her final place of residence prior to deportation was extremely difficult for one reason. There were multiple addresses associated with her name in myriad books and archives. According to an online archive based in the Czech Republic, which contains Regina's death certificate from Theresienstadt, which you'll see here, her last known address was indicated as Hallensee, Eisenzahnstraße 6 in Wilmersdorf-Charlottenburg, which is a suburb of Berlin. A document found in an archive featuring various works and correspondences belonging to her son, my great-grandfather Walter Victor, indicated that Regina lived briefly at a home located at Siebelstraße 67, just 10 minutes away from the address listed on her death certificate. Furthermore, the Gedenkbuch, or memorial book in English, which lists the addresses of all Jewish residents who lived in this suburb, as recorded in the 1930 census, reveals that Regina lived in an apartment at Siebel Street 19, though now we're facing 3 different addresses where this person lived. After much research, I concluded that for an unknown number of months prior to her deportation to Czechoslovakia, Regina was imprisoned at the living space in Eisenzahnstraße in what in Nazi terminology was called a Judenhaus. A Judenhaus, or Jewish house, was a temporary method of marginalizing, segregating, and ghettoizing Jews in Germany between 1939 and 1945. On my first encounter with the term, I came to find that after the Nazis took power in 1933, in addition to enacting over 400 decrees and regulations, which gradually limited the rights of freedoms of Jews in Germany, the Third Reich also instituted a lengthy series of measures which restricted Jews' access to housing and tenancy rights. These laws, which combined to form Nazi housing policy, resulted in the creation of Jewish houses across Germany, which were designed to imprison German Jews in retrofitted living spaces that had since been abandoned by their Jewish tenants after the Reich instituted laws to achieve the de-Jewification of the housing market. It seemed apparent, upon further investigation of Regina's story, that she was taken from her home at Siebel Street 19 and confined in a Jewish house on Eisenzahnstraße in order to ensure that she, like thousands of other Jews in Berlin and across Germany, was sufficiently sequestered, persecuted, and ostracized just prior to deportation. Between 1933 and 1935, growing hostility towards Jews, bolstered by Nazi decrees, such as those which excluded Jews from the civil service, made it especially difficult for migrating Jews to find suitable housing. Among the many legislative initiatives which Hitler's government passed to achieve the Entfernung, or the removal of Jews from the housing market, some of the most significant include the passage of the Nuremberg laws in 1935. In addition to forbidding marriages between Jews and non-Jews, German Jews who had recently immigrated were expelled en masse from municipal housing estates, from row houses and apartment buildings. In addition, by 1938, Jews, including Regina, who had come under severe economic hardship after being stripped of employment, were denied leases and rental contracts by German landlords, which were declared null and void by local courts, which was corroborated by paperwork that we found in the archive. The same thing happened to Regina. Additionally, in December of 1938, which was a time when slogans such as "boot the Jews out of the good, cheap apartments" could be read on those public signposts, the passage of the Decree on the Use of Jewish Property was passed, which required that all Jewish homeowners sell their real estate and allow for German landlords and tenants to immediately take ownership of their living spaces. Well, I don't have time here to delve even further into the research process or to the many fascinating discoveries my mother and I made while on that research trip we found extensive evidence that the Judenhäuser imprisoned hundreds of thousands of German Jews as a preparatory and transitory measure before their forced deportation to the concentration camps. These final holding centers included synagogues, yeshivas, which are Jewish religious institutions, Orthodox community centers, homes for the elderly, Jewish hospitals, and even abandoned armament and textile factories. Ultimately, my finding was that despite the seemingly systematic efforts which Nazis used to achieve the concentration of Jews in Judenland, upon analysis of the extent of the disjointed network, the inconsistent reasons for their creation, and the disordered composition of the communities of inhabitants in the Jewish houses, the degree to which the Jewish houses typify the disorganization of the Nazi bureaucracy became apparent. So very briefly, as I mentioned at the top, I sort of feel as if my third generation experience is encapsulated in channeling, hearing about my grandmother's story into family research, as well as I believe there's a connection between family history and what I chose to do professionally, despite law school taking up a lot of my sleep and time. So very briefly to that vein, I will just mention that much of the work I have done during my short time in law school has surrounded working with refugees and asylum seekers on affirmative and humanitarian asylum claims, like I mentioned. I done the work for an organization called the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, which is a massive legal nonprofit which participates in litigation and advocacy. And it's imbued me with some pride to be a very tiny cog in a community of lawyers working tirelessly to fulfill the United States promise of protecting those escaping persecution. My interest in and passion for this work, as you might be able to glean, is rooted very deeply in my grandmother's and my family's struggle to immigrate to and ultimately assimilate in this country. I feel very grateful to be able to do this work to support refugees navigating the complex American immigration system, which is a sort of support my family did not have when they came to this country. I'll be spending the summer in Philadelphia working for an organization once called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, an organization that has its roots in providing humanitarian aid and assistance to Jewish refugees since 1881. So I'll finish. Oh, forgot about this. Sorry. My fault.
I'm falling off the job.
No, the slides were my fault. This is Regina, as I pointed to earlier. I just really love that photo of her.
Yeah.
And this was from that same visit my mother mentioned to Berlin in 2019. This is obviously not what the building looked like. It was rebuilt after the Allied bombings of Berlin. But this is the address where Regina voluntarily lived, where she chose to live, not Eisenstahnstraße, where she was imprisoned before she was deported.
Did you say that's in Charlottenburg?
It's in Charlottenburg, that's right. Yeah, so if those who know Germany, Charlottenburg is on the west side of Berlin and what is now a very nice neighborhood.
Picture, where'd it go? All right, they got mixed up. There's a picture of us in 2022 when you went to see it. My husband too. The three of us saw the Stolpersteine. You can see where it's engraved. Can you tell them what happened? Not so much.
Oh yeah. Okay, so very brief story off the script here. This moment, maybe a couple minutes after this happened, honestly, my father was there also. The man who actually lives at Ziebel Street 19, or in one of the rooms in this apartment building. Yeah, he lives here, came up to us and in German started sort of just yelling nonsense, which was kind of,
what are you doing here?
What are you doing here? Yeah, why are you, what is this? And my mom, who's German, is much better than mine, especially in crisis situations. Responded to him very kindly. Right?
Using the formal you.
Pretty nice of her.
Trying to calm him down.
To say this is basically, he was saying, my family were all killed by the Soviets. Why do I not get this memorial when your family does? And it was tough because it was sort of all a mix of yelling and back and forth. And then at one point, another neighbor who lived at this same building was a woman on her balcony who, if you'll excuse an expletive, basically in German said, "You asshole, learn your history, read your textbooks."
Yeah, she was amazing. And then my husband spent the rest of the trip joyfully saying Arschloch because it was a new word for him. She saved us from the argument while she helped.
Yeah. So while sort of,
awful.
Yeah, it was a pretty tough couple of minutes, but I think it was the first time we all saw the stumbling stone you've now heard about all the research, right, that we put into it and the work we did. So it was just an important moment of like agglomeration of memory in Germany.
Yeah.
Anyway,
This was us, this one, yeah.
sorry, all the slides. Last slide to point out, this is the track. It's called Gleis 17 for those who have been to Berlin, been to Germany. It's an infamous track. No, trains are no longer allowed to use this track. It's where the majority of German Jews from the city of Berlin were deported, or were forcibly taken to camps. And if you go there now, you can see all the names of camps. You'll see the Lodz ghettos referenced here, the date that people were deported, as well as the number of Jews that were deported on a specific day. So that's a pretty amazing memorial. It's where Regina was deported from. Oh yeah, this was the reference to the housing laws that I mentioned.
That's great.
All right.
Bad assistant.
You're doing great. Okay, I'll give you this. So I think we'll finish our presentation with a quote that I think the three of us believe captures all the themes that we've articulated today, which reads, "We must be listened to above and beyond our personal experience. We've collectively witnessed a fundamental, unexpected event, fundamental precisely because unexpected, not foreseen by anyone. It happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say." Thank you so much for listening.
Questions? Yeah, Joshua.
I guess this question could go out to all three of you, but in particular with being in three separate generations, is there anything in particular that you would want like to pass down to your children and grandchildren and so on and so forth? If there was just one thing that you could ask them or tell them, what's one thing you want to convey to them?
Oh, goodness. I think that I just wanted to be known that they lived and who they were, and the honor them.
It's interesting. Micah didn't mention this, but that picture of my grandmother's family at that wedding, which was just it was such a huge deal. This cousin from Illinois connected to the family that ultimately did sponsor them. But anyway, that was problematic. She gives us this picture and my grandmother couldn't bear to have it in her apartment. Gives it to me on the day of my wedding. I guess a wedding present. And then for years it was hanging on this little wall outside Micah's bedroom. I don't think we thought about it. But for years he woke up and looked at this picture and moved it. I don't mind telling you that, but it's just that picture threads throughout the generations.
Susan and Micah, maybe you could speak a bit to the work that's being done through the Education Committee and the role of not just the survivors, but descendants and their descendants in sharing these stories and in trying to counter intolerance and support young people in our school systems to have a broader perspective.
I think we said a few words. Some people here were at the 40th anniversary celebration of the Alliance, and we both talked briefly about what it means to speak in the schools. My mother probably regularly does probably about 3 presentations a month. This month it gets quite busy. So much for retirement, right? Like I took on coordinating this group of amazing speakers. My mother plus 20 second generation, and then 1 third generation Armenian descendant, Christine. And it's such a privilege. Like I love these people. There's a part of me that just loves these people and loves them because of what we do, what we're compelled to do. And one of our members said recently, our work has never been more important. And we all share a common, the common thread for all of us is, like you heard my mom say, it's about understanding themes like scapegoating, prejudice, oppression of any peoples.
Yes, exactly.
The roots of anti-Semitism, racism, transphobia, anything, and that's what we bring to middle and high school students. That's our message. What's this have to do with you and your day-to-day relationships? And also how you're treated as teenagers, you know. My mother is currently the only living survivor of the group, or as I said, all second generations, but we're in the process of hoping to form what we call a 3G, a third generation group that my daughter's going to coordinate. Because we need now to take something like what Micah did, but prepare a story to present to students, because at some point we'll have to take it on. And that's our hope, and that's the mandate.
Questions for Rena.
Yes.
Before the Holocaust, what did being Jewish mean to you? And after the Holocaust, did that change?
Well, as was mentioned before, since I, had a non-Jewish father who had certainly offered to become Jewish, and my grandmother said not necessary, but and probably saved us that way. But so we celebrated Christmas, and of course we also, my father encouraged us to celebrate the Jewish holidays, so we did sort of both, and we would go to the Jewish Community Center and observe some things, and have parties and so on. I was aware of it, but I think I felt a bit different from most of my classmates, for example, and I think, but I just I don't know how much thought I gave it really. And you asked them. I'm sorry. The rest of it.
And after the Holocaust,
After the Holocaust, yeah, it is complicated because, as Susan mentioned, my first husband, Susan's father, who tragically died much too young, he felt very close to being Jewish, but he was an atheist, I guess, or agnostic. But I was always more aware of it, and it meant a lot to me. More so, it's funny, both my sisters went in different directions. One is an atheist, and the other one became a Lutheran. I'm the only one who returned to Judaism, and it's been very important to me. And I feel like I became close to it again because I think of my grandmother and my family. That had a lot to do with it. It is who I am.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all three of you for your courage to share in such a public forum your painful histories. And we could see and hear the incredible burden that's being passed on from generation to generation down to the third. And it's really important to think about that legacy, the awful legacy, and difficult emotional legacy to carry it on. In my listening to you all three, and then especially Micah, I was wondering, what about the next generation, the fourth generation? What are your thoughts about that? Any speculations?
Wait, you're talking about him having children?
Maybe not, yeah.
Micah has an announcement to make.
Couldn't be more.
Oh, Lord.
Because it almost seems like there's some kind of a hopeful turn happening, certainly listening to you too, to really making, trying to address things in a very concrete, professional way, and creating justice, dealing with injustices of all kinds today.
What do you think, Davita? I mean, you're older, so I think you've thought about it.
I think Micah and I are trying really hard to understand it and take it in and use it in a certain way. And I guess before the next generation comes, really, take it into who we are and understand it within our professions, me as a psychologist and Micah as a lawyer, and, take it into who we are and then pass it down, with a better understanding of what it means, I think, and how it has impacted us through the generations. And I think my mom has taught us to use it in all of these wonderful ways. And now I think it's our job to really, I don't know, Micah, like integrate it into who we are as people. And I think that's how we would pass it on to the next with a better understanding of it. I
Yeah.
think that's my goal. I don't know if it's yours too.
Yeah. I completely agree. I'll stand up so you can see me. Hello. I'm not having a child. No, I think that's well, I agree. And I think to your question, Michaela, it actually gets, I feel like, at the core of an anxiety that I think we both have, in addition to integrating it into what we're interested in. I sort of touched on that in terms of the constant genuine desire to dig into the past, like Naomi and I often talk about whenever we see each other. We'll ask about family history. I think the anxiety that I have is gathering all of it in my brain and cementing it so there is no detail that I missed and eventually actually passing it on to my one day children. And also knowing that that's never going to be the case, right? We can never get every detail because we weren't there. But I think, it comes up in different ways, right? Like we've been talking about, we should have Naomi have Rena tell her story for an online archive like the Shoah Foundation, or there's like sort of a constant need to cement it, right, in history. So we do pass on the most accurate history, but that's also difficult to do because it's never going to come from her.
But that's
We don't
that's the
want it to be
paradigm.
forgotten.
Right.
I think that's the most important thing. Wow.
I was gonna say, that's sort of the paradox. I mean, like I said, I was so blessed that my grandmother, after 40 years, when I became a German teacher, she decided to speak, which is really interesting to think about. She came to my classes and then she came to my college classes. And then when she died, my mother took this on until years ago. But I for years was so upset that I know and still know so little about what happened to my father because we never could talk about any of it at all. Complete silence.
Right.
But now I understand that, that his goal, was that my brother and I come to this country, have very American names that traveled well, that we assimilated and were safe. I remember once somebody must have given me a Star of David and, my brother and I weren't raised with Judaism at all. But I don't know who gave it to me, but I put it on and my father's face, I remember. Very uncomfortable, and he said, well, you don't seem very Jewish, so maybe it'll be okay. I remember him saying something. Yeah, I remember him saying something like that. You don't seem Jewish, so maybe. But I think I took it off. But I think that generation, my husband's a psychologist, we talk about this a lot, that generation just didn't talk about it. His mother didn't talk about it either. They got out in 41, it wasn't easy for them either, his mother's family. But what was hard for my husband, my generation, is that things were kind of dribbled on us. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like best exercise I ever got was the graves or the eating habits. Like there was darkness in the home. There were things that you could pick up, but nobody was explaining. And so I think our goal, he's a psychologist and I'm a teacher, and our goal was to provide the stories to these two more consciously and deliberately. So hopefully that's what's going to continue. Like Davita said, that you can integrate it. And just a way to pass it on that feels right and healthy and careful and productive in a social justice sense.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is bad form for the professor to ask. So a couple of years ago, I came across an op-ed in the site. It was written by an American Jew who had taken up permanent residence in Germany, and he said he thought contemporary Germany suffered from philo-Semitism, which is he was everybody's everybody's Jewish friend because there were so few Jews there. And he felt he was kind of a novelty. But it seems like your experience is a little bit different. There's a real reluctance that you've been to remember. For instance, the man confronting you in Charlottenburg about the stone in the sidewalk.
And it was very consequence about it. It was another 40 years to open up. And as paid for appreciating history, do not that quick to talk about it. And she experienced the worst kind of the trauma in the 90s, but in Victoria, we had three small children, and we had to, carry on as that thing. Yeah.
Well, I think when we go to Germany, I don't know if we all three have that. I think we do. Very last trip when she talked briefly to her cousin, and then I'm very close to that cousin's daughter who asked me on the last trip, why did your family actually leave Germany? And in that moment, even though we were sharing a bottle of wine, I could not find an answer. Right? I couldn't even formulate where to start with that, and was so struck by the question. And I think that those cousins have kind of forced us, and maybe we would have done it anyway, forced us to be German when we're there. And maybe Jewish when we're here. I don't know, but I don't feel like I bring the Jewishness there. I don't bring the Holocaust there. And that's not really good. It's not really healthy. Have we experienced overt anti-Semitism? I don't even know if the guy was anti-Semitic who yelled at us. We don't know. I mean, it was unpleasant and awful. Afterwards, Micah and I and my husband got on the bus and we were crying. And I remember hearing my dad's voice, something like, you can never go back. And that was the feeling I had with this man yelling at us. Oh, okay, we really can't go back. But I think the painful thing is that we have to still separate the identities.
I'm popping up and down. A really good question. I think really on that same point, there's the small example that comes to mind, which we've talked about before, that I think there's both sort of the two identities dynamic in my experience as a Jewish person, having gone to Germany many times, but also the philo anti-Semitism? Philo-Semitism. It's definitely released, I think, in my experience in the academic setting. And then I can recall the broad program that I was in for a couple of months had very intensive German classes. And in my journal, professor had graded our journal at the end of the semester. And said, I always find in German, she wrote, I always find it interesting when Jews independently choose to come back to Germany. Wow. And we sort of throughout the semester, she was sort of treating me in that way. I think I was one of the few Jewish people in this program. And it's almost like you feel like you're like a live museum or something. It's like, how do you come back?
Right.
It's like, I didn't come back. I was,
right.
So yeah, I think that's a real experience.
We are running out of time. Is there a last question, Victoria?
I suppose this question is building off of it. Do you feel that eventually Germany might be able to not outgrow, but come to terms properly with its past and be able to re-accept the fact that you can be German and Jewish with the complicated political situation that still exists in Germany?
It's interesting when Angela Merkel took in, what was it, 800,000 Syrian refugees? Is that number about right? A lot. And I remember how happy we talked about that. It was as though we were, I don't know if it was something like empathy, but also just made us feel reassured about Germany that they were going to do that. So we found at the place of feeling reassured when Germany acts in those ways that we would. But I don't know if we've gone that far to think about it. I think there may be 150,000 Jews in Germany. Does that sound right? I think 109,000 of those live in Berlin. Russian, Ukrainian, and loads of Israelis. Yeah. I don't know. It's almost you've had more time with descendants of survivors and I don't think it feels quite that way for us yet.